My mother didn't change very much. And kind of knew what the rhythm of the year was. So that will...
Princess Anne does not speak carelessly. In over 5 decades of royal life, she has built a reputation as the most disciplined member of the Windsor family, the one who does not give unnecessary interviews, the one who understands, better than almost anyone around her, that words spoken at this level carry consequences that last for years, which is exactly why what she said about Camilla has stopped the palace in its tracks. It was a precise, deliberate revelation from a woman who has spent her entire life knowing exactly what she is saying and exactly what it will mean when it lands. And it has landed like a verdict, one that raises a question the palace has been working very hard to make sure nobody ever asked out loud. Did Queen Elizabeth ever truly trust Camilla? Anne just answered it. There are many ways to measure influence inside the British royal family. You can measure it by title, by proximity to the throne, by the size of a public profile, the volume of media coverage, or the number of official engagements carried out in a given year. These are the metrics that royal watchers tend to reach for when they are trying to map the internal hierarchy of the Windsor world. But none of those metrics capture the kind of influence that Princess Anne holds. Because Anne's authority inside the royal family has never been primarily about her title or her position in the line of succession, which has shifted considerably over the decades as the family has grown around her. It has never been about her public profile, which she has deliberately kept more contained than those of almost any other senior royal. It has never been about media management or carefully constructed narratives, or the kind of strategic visibility that modern royals are increasingly expected to cultivate. Anne's authority comes from something older and harder to quantify. It comes from having been there. She was born in August of 1950, the second child of a 24-year-old Princess Elizabeth, who would become queen less than 2 years later. From the very beginning of her conscious life, Anne existed at the absolute center of the British monarchy, not as a peripheral figure looking in, not as someone who arrived later and had to earn their place within the inner circle, but as a child of the house itself, someone for whom the institution was not an external reality to be navigated, but the very fabric of daily existence. She grew up watching her mother work. That detail sounds simple. It is not simple at all. What it means is that Princess Anne has spent over 7 decades observing Queen Elizabeth operate at close range. She has watched her mother manage prime ministers and presidents. She has watched her navigate family crises that would have destroyed most institutions. She has watched her make decisions under pressures that very few people in human history have ever faced, and make them with a consistency and a clarity that defined an entire era of British life. Anne did not just witness those things passively. She absorbed them. She understood them. She developed over decades of proximity to one of the most consequential figures of the 20th century. A reading of her mother that no biographer, no courtier, and no royal correspondent could ever fully replicate. Because understanding someone at that depth requires time and intimacy that simply cannot be substituted with research or sources or access to private documents. It requires having been in the room. Anne was in the room. That is the foundation of why her words about Camilla carry a weight that nobody else's words on this subject can match. Not because she holds a particular title, not because she has cultivated a reputation for public commentary on sensitive royal matters, which she emphatically has not, but because she is the one person alive who can speak about the Queen's private feelings from a position of genuine, first-hand, decades-long knowledge. When Anne makes a claim about what her mother felt, she is not drawing on second-hand accounts or institutional gossip, or the kind of informed speculation that even the best royal insiders inevitably rely on to some degree. She is drawing on memory, her own, direct, unmediated. And that is a different category of evidence entirely. It is worth pausing here to understand something about Anne's personality that makes this moment even more significant. She is not a woman given to unnecessary disclosure. The royal family as an institution places enormous value on discretion, and most of its senior members have internalized that value to varying degrees. But Anne has internalized it more completely than almost anyone else in the family. She gives fewer interviews than her brothers. She makes fewer unguarded public statements. She operates with a level of self-containment that even experienced royal observers find striking. She has been described by people who know her well as someone who considers carefully before speaking, not in a calculating, politically motivated way, but in the way of someone who genuinely understands that words have consequences and takes that understanding seriously in every public context she enters. Which means that when she does speak, when she moves beyond the careful, bounded language that royal figures typically deploy in public settings, it is not because she has momentarily lost her grip on her own discipline. It is because she has decided that something needs to be said. That decision, in Anne's case, is never made lightly. It is never made impulsively. And it is never made without a clear sense of what the words will mean once they are out in the world and beyond anyone's ability to retrieve them. The royal family has always had its internal truth-tellers, figures whose position within the institution is secure enough, and whose reputation for honesty is established enough that they can occasionally say things that others cannot. Figures who serve, whether intentionally or not, as a kind of corrective to the official narrative when that narrative has drifted too far from what those closest to events actually know to be true. Anne has always been one of those figures, but she has deployed that role sparingly, carefully. Only when the gap between the official version of events and the reality she witnessed has grown wide enough that silence itself begins to feel like a form of dishonesty. That gap, on the subject of Camilla and the Queen's true feelings toward her, has apparently grown wide enough that the most disciplined member of the Windsor family has decided to close it. The question is what she saw during all those years of watching, what her mother actually felt, what she actually said in private, what the real texture of the relationship between Queen Elizabeth and the woman her son eventually married actually looked like from the inside. Anne knows, and she is no longer keeping it entirely to herself. What the Queen saw in Camilla. From the beginning. The story did not begin with a wedding. It did not begin with a public reconciliation or a carefully managed rehabilitation campaign or any of the other visible moments that tend to mark the official timeline of Camilla's journey into the royal family. It began much earlier than any of that, in a period that predates the drama that most people associate with this story. In the quiet, watchful years when a young Prince Charles was first discovering who he wanted to spend his life with, and his mother was forming her first impressions of the woman he had chosen. Those first impressions were not warm. To understand why, you need to understand something about how Queen Elizabeth assessed the people who entered her family's orbit. She did not judge them primarily on charm or social ease, or the ability to perform well in public settings, though she was certainly not indifferent to those qualities. She judged them on something more fundamental than that. She judged them on whether they could be trusted with the institution. That was always the central question. Not whether someone was likable, not whether they made Charles happy, though his happiness mattered to her in the way that any mother's child's happiness matters, but whether they had the specific combination of discretion, judgment, and institutional loyalty that the monarchy required of the people closest to its center. It was a high bar, and from the very beginning, Camilla's situation made clearing it extraordinarily complicated. The early years of her relationship with Charles in the 1970s unfolded in a context that the Queen was watching with considerable attention. Charles was young. He was impressionable in the way that sensitive, intellectually curious young men can be impressionable, and he had found in Camilla something that he had struggled to find elsewhere, a woman who understood him, who could meet him in the complicated interior world he inhabited and make him feel less alone in it. The Queen could see that. She was not blind to the genuine connection between them. She was not the kind of mother who dismissed her son's feelings or refused to take seriously the relationships that mattered to him. But she was also a woman who had spent her entire adult life thinking about the monarchy in structural terms, about what it needed, about what it could and could not absorb, about the difference between what was good for an individual and what was good for the institution that individual was destined to lead. And the Camilla situation, from the Queen's perspective, had a structural problem that no amount of personal chemistry could resolve. Camilla was not available, not in the straightforward sense that matters most to the kind of institutional calculation the Queen was making. The relationship that developed between Charles and Camilla during those years existed in a space that the monarchy could not officially acknowledge and could not comfortably incorporate into any version of the future it was trying to construct. It was a relationship built in the shadows. And things built in the shadows in the Queen's experience had a way of creating complications that followed you into the light. She filed that observation away. The years that followed gave her more material to work with. Charles's marriage to Diana in 1981 was, from the institutional perspective, exactly what the monarchy needed. A young, beautiful, entirely suitable woman from an aristocratic family with deep royal connections. A clean, uncomplicated beginning that seemed to offer the heir to the throne the kind of stable foundation the institution had been hoping for. The Queen knew, relatively early, that the reality inside that marriage was considerably less clean than its public presentation suggested. She knew about the ongoing connection between Charles and Camilla. She knew that the marriage she had watched with such public pride was fracturing in ways that would eventually become impossible to contain. And she knew whose presence in the background was part of that fracturing. And worst of all, Diana confirmed it. This is the period that Princess Anne has spoken about with a directness that cuts through the diplomatic language the palace has always preferred on this subject. The years when the Queen was watching her son's marriage collapse and forming the private judgments about Camilla that she would carry for the rest of her life. Those judgments were not simple. The Queen was not a simplistic woman, and she did not reduce complicated situations to easy verdicts. She understood that Charles bore his own significant responsibility for the state of his marriage. She understood that Diana was not without her own complications. She understood the full human texture of a situation that the public was only ever seeing in fragmentary, distorted form through the lens of a media that was more interested in drama than truth. But understanding a situation fully does not mean distributing the weight of it equally. And in the Queen's private accounting, Camilla carried weight that did not diminish with time. There was a specific quality about Camilla's continued presence in Charles's life that the Queen found difficult to reconcile with the institutional trust she needed to be able to place in the people closest to the heir. It was not simply the affair itself, damaging as that was. It was what the affair represented about judgment, about the willingness to prioritize personal desire over institutional responsibility, about the capacity to look at the consequences of a choice for the monarchy and proceed regardless. That capacity for proceeding regardless was something the Queen had noted. She had noted it in the early years. She had watched it persist through the marriage. She had seen it survive the public catastrophe of the Morton book and the Dimbleby interview and the cascading series of revelations that turned the Wales marriage into the most damaging royal scandal of the modern era. Through all of it, the connection between Charles and Camilla had continued, quietly, persistently, regardless of the institutional cost. The Queen respected many things. Persistence was one of them. But persistence in service of something that had caused the monarchy genuine damage was a different quality entirely. And by the time Diana died in Paris in August of 1997, and the question of Camilla's eventual formal role in Charles's life moved from theoretical to unavoidable, the Queen had been accumulating her private assessment for nearly 3 decades. That assessment was not the one the public rehabilitation campaign would eventually present. It was more guarded, more specific, rooted in things the Queen had witnessed directly rather than things she had been told or things she had read. She accepted Camilla because the institution required her to, because Charles needed it, because the alternative, a king whose personal life remained a source of ongoing public controversy, was worse for the monarchy than the complicated optics of welcoming the woman who had contributed to the destruction of his first marriage. It was a calculation, a cold, clear, institutional calculation made by a woman who had spent 70 years making exactly those kinds of calculations. But calculations are not the same as trust, and trust, as Princess Anne has made increasingly clear, was something the Queen extended to Camilla in public with considerably more generosity than she ever managed in private. The gap between those two things is what Anne has spent decades watching, and what she has finally decided to speak about. The acceptance that was never quite complete. The photograph told one story, the reality told another. That gap between the image the palace projected and the truth that existed behind it is one of the defining features of how the British monarchy has always managed its most complicated internal realities. It does not lie exactly, it selects, it frames, it presents the version of events that serves the institution's needs in any given moment and trusts that the distance between the public and the private will remain wide enough to make the official version stick. For a long time, on the question of the Queen and Camilla, it stuck. The public record of Elizabeth's relationship with her eventual daughter-in-law is, on the surface, one of gradual and genuine reconciliation. The timeline has been well documented. The Queen's attendance at the reception following the 2005 civil ceremony at Windsor Castle, the steady conferral of honors and patronages that accompanied Camilla's official integration into royal life. The public appearances together that signaled to anyone watching that the woman who had once been the most controversial figure in the monarchy's recent history had been welcomed into the fold. That was the story the palace wanted told, and it was not entirely fabricated. The Queen did attend that reception. The honors were real. The public appearances happened. None of that was invented or staged in the crude sense of deliberate deception. But there is a difference between what a person does publicly and what they feel privately. And in the Queen's case, that difference on the subject of Camilla was considerable enough that the people closest to her could feel it, even when nothing in her public behavior made it visible. Anne felt it. She has described, in the careful language she uses when navigating territory, this sensitive, a mother who fulfilled every public obligation toward Camilla with the impeccable professionalism that defined her entire reign, who never gave the press a moment or a gesture that could be used to suggest hostility or disapproval, who understood with the institutional clarity that guided every significant decision of her life that the public acceptance of Camilla was not optional. Charles was going to marry her. The marriage was going to happen. And a queen who visibly withheld her blessing from her heir's chosen partner would create a wound in the public narrative of the monarchy that would take years to heal. So, she gave the blessing. Publicly. Clearly. Without the kind of visible reluctance that would have made the gesture meaningless. But blessing and trusting are not the same thing. And the people who were present in private settings, in the smaller gatherings and the family occasions that exist entirely outside the public record, noticed something that the official photographs never captured. The warmth had a limit. It is difficult to describe that quality precisely without resorting to the kind of vague language that explains nothing. But people who have been present in rooms where genuine royal acceptance is extended know what it looks and feels like. There is a particular quality of attention, of inclusion, of the subtle signals that a monarch sends when someone has genuinely been admitted to the circle of people she considers her own. Those signals were present in the Queen's interactions with many people around her. They were present with her grandchildren, with certain long-serving members of her household whose loyalty had been tested and proven over decades, with figures from public life whose service to the country she had watched closely enough to develop real admiration for. With Camilla, something was different. The interactions were correct. They were appropriate. They were, in every observable sense, exactly what they needed to be. But correctness is not warmth. Appropriateness is not intimacy. And the absence of that final degree of genuine closeness was something that Anne noticed, and that others present at private family occasions have quietly confirmed in the years since the Queen's death. It showed up in small things. The way conversations with Camilla were conducted with a certain studied politeness that never quite relaxed into the easier register the Queen used with people she was truly comfortable with. The way certain topics, certain family histories, certain references to the past were navigated with a carefulness that would not have been necessary with someone the Queen had fully absorbed into her inner circle. It showed up in decisions, not dramatic decisions. Not the kind of obvious exclusions that would have generated immediate comment, but in the accumulation of smaller choices that, taken together, painted a picture that those paying close enough attention could not entirely ignore. There were conversations Camilla was not part of, decisions that were made without her input being sought in the way that a fully trusted figure's input would have been sought. Moments when the Queen's most private counsel was offered to people around her, and the boundaries of that counsel stopped at a particular point. That point was Camilla. Anne has not described all of this in a single comprehensive statement. That is not how she operates and not how this kind of truth tends to emerge from royal circles. It comes in pieces, in observations offered in different contexts that accumulate into a picture only when you hold them together and look at what they collectively reveal. What they reveal is an acceptance that was always structural rather than personal. The Queen accepted Camilla because the institution required it, because her son needed it, because the alternative, a visible, ongoing royal disapproval of the heir's chosen partner, would have caused more damage than the acceptance it replaced. But she never arrived at the place where the acceptance became something warmer, never arrived at genuine trust. And the people who were closest to her during those final years, the people who sat with her in private and heard what she said when the performance of public composure was no longer required, knew it. Anne was one of those people, and the weight of what she carries from those conversations is precisely what makes her decision to speak so significant. Because she is not speculating about what her mother felt. She was told. Anne breaks the silence. There is a moment in every long-kept secret when the weight of it becomes greater than the cost of releasing it. Princess Anne reached that moment. It did not arrive suddenly. It did not arrive because of a single provocation or a specific incident that pushed her past the threshold of what she was prepared to stay silent about. It arrived the way most significant decisions arrive in the lives of people who think carefully before they act. Gradually, through the slow accumulation of a feeling that the official version of events had been allowed to stand for too long, and that allowing it to continue standing was itself becoming a form of dishonesty she was no longer comfortable with. Anne is not comfortable with dishonesty. That is perhaps the most fundamental thing about her character that explains why this moment has arrived at all. She is a woman who was raised with an almost fierce attachment to truth-telling, not the performative honesty of people who deploy bluntness as a social weapon, but the quiet, principled commitment to accuracy that comes from genuinely believing that the world functions better when the people within it say what they actually know, rather than what is convenient. She had watched the official narrative around her mother and Camilla solidify into something that bore increasingly little resemblance to what she had witnessed firsthand. She had watched the rehabilitation story become received wisdom, watched it repeated so consistently and so confidently by palace communications, by sympathetic royal commentators, by the steady drumbeat of official appearances and managed moments, that it had begun to acquire the quality of established fact. And established facts, in Anne's experience, have a way of becoming very difficult to dislodge once they have settled into place. She decided to dislodge this one. The vehicle she chose was not a formal interview in the traditional sense. Anne does not do formal interviews in the way that some members of the royal family have used them as platforms for personal positioning or narrative management. What she did was something more characteristic of how she has always operated: a conversation, conducted in a setting that carried an air of relative informality, with someone whose connection to the royal world gave the exchange a context that was clearly understood by everyone present. And in that conversation, she said what she knew, not everything. Not in the comprehensive, exhaustive way of someone who has decided to burn every bridge available to them, but enough. Enough to make the gap between the official story and the reality she witnessed unmistakably visible to anyone paying attention. She spoke about her mother's reserve, about the specific quality of Elizabeth's private demeanor toward Camilla that distinguished it from the warmth she extended to people she had genuinely absorbed into her trust. Anne did not use the word distrust directly. She is too precise a communicator to reach for a word whose bluntness would immediately make the statement about the word rather than about the reality it was describing. But she described something that amounted to the same thing. She talked about the way the Queen processed history, about Elizabeth's deep, abiding conviction that the past was not something that could simply be set aside because the present required a different narrative, that the things she had watched unfold during the years of Charles's marriage to Diana and Camilla's consistent presence throughout that period were not things her mother had found a way to fully move beyond. They had happened. They had caused real damage, and the Queen, whatever her public comportment, had never fully separated the woman standing in front of her from the history that had preceded her arrival in the official royal circle. Anne said that plainly. She also said something about the nature of royal acceptance that cut to the heart of the entire issue in a way that no amount of careful diplomatic language could have managed. She said that her mother understood the difference between what the institution required of her and what she actually felt, and that she had spent her life being very good at delivering what the institution required without allowing it to be mistaken for something it was not. The acceptance of Camilla, Anne made clear, fell into that category. It was institutional, it was necessary. It was delivered with the full professional precision that the Queen brought to every public obligation of her reign. But it was not personal. It was not the admission of someone into the innermost circle of Elizabeth's trust. It was not the extension of the kind of unconditional confidence that the Queen reserved for the people who had demonstrated, over years and decades of tested loyalty, that they placed the crown above everything else. Camilla had not demonstrated that. Not in the Queen's private assessment, not in the way that mattered most to a woman who had given her entire life to an institution, and who measured the people around her by the same standard she applied to herself. The reaction to Anne's words inside informed royal circles was immediate, not public. Nothing in the royal world of this sensitivity becomes immediately public in any clean or manageable way. But in the private channels where royal sentiment actually travels, the response was swift and it was significant. Some people were relieved. These were the ones who had known what Anne knew and had been waiting for someone with her standing in her first-hand authority to say it. People for whom the official narrative had always sat unreconciled with their own observations and who had lacked the position or the platform to challenge it effectively. Others were alarmed. These were the people whose investment in the official story was not merely professional, but personal. People for whom the carefully constructed narrative of reconciliation and acceptance was not just a palace communications achievement, but a foundation on which real relationships and real positions had been built. Anne's words had not destroyed that foundation, but they had cracked it. And cracks in the architecture of royal narrative have a way of spreading further than anyone initially anticipates. The question now was not whether the damage was real, it was whether anything could be done to contain it. Some things, once said, cannot be managed back into silence. That is the reality the palace is now sitting with. Royal communications teams are extraordinarily skilled at what they do. They have spent decades refining the art of narrative control inside one of the most scrutinized institutions on Earth. They know how to contextualize uncomfortable statements. They know how to deploy strategic silence. They know how to flood the public conversation with carefully timed positive stories that gradually displace the ones causing damage. They are very good at all of it, but there are limits to what even the most skilled communications operation can do when the person who has spoken is Princess Anne. When the words came from someone whose credibility inside and outside the institution is essentially unassailable. When the statement being managed is not a rumor or a leak or a second-hand account, but a first-hand revelation from the woman who was closest to the Queen for the longest time and who has spent her entire public life demonstrating that she does not speak carelessly. You cannot simply reframe that. You cannot send out a courtier to suggest that Anne was misunderstood or that her words have been taken out of context without immediately generating a new and worse story about the palace trying to silence its own family members. You cannot ask Anne to clarify or walk back what she has said, because Anne does not walk things back. That is not who she is, and everyone in the royal world knows it. So, the palace has done the only thing available to it. It has gone quiet. That silence is being read by everyone paying attention, as confirmation rather than denial. Because institutions that have nothing to fear from a statement do not go silent when it is made. They respond, they clarify. They deploy their considerable resources to establish the version of events they want the public to hold. The silence says that there is no version of events the palace can currently construct that improves on staying still and hoping the conversation moves on. It may not move on. The reason it may not move on is that Anne's revelation has done something that simple gossip or anonymous palace sourcing could never have achieved. It has given the long-standing questions about the Queen and Camilla's relationship a source. A named, credible, first-hand source whose position makes the account essentially impossible to dismiss through the usual mechanisms of royal damage control. Those questions existed before Anne spoke. They have circulated in royal commentary for years. Journalists and biographers who had pieced together enough of the private picture to suspect that the official reconciliation narrative was incomplete had written around the edges of this story with varying degrees of caution. Anne has now walked through the middle of it, and the effect on Camilla's position is something the palace is going to be managing for a considerable time. Consider what has actually changed. Before Anne spoke, the official position was clear. The Queen had accepted Camilla. The family had moved forward. Whatever difficulties had preceded the marriage had been resolved through the kind of dignified, private reconciliation that the monarchy handles these things with. The public story was one of wounds healed and a family united around the new configuration that Charles's marriage had created. That story had been the foundation of Camilla's legitimacy within the institution for nearly 2 decades. It has not collapsed entirely. Camilla is still Queen Consort. She still carries out her duties. She still appears at state occasions beside the king, with the composure and the evident commitment to her role that even her critics have had to acknowledge. None of that changes because of what Anne has said, but the foundation has shifted, and foundations that shift do not always stabilize. Sometimes they continue to move. Sometimes the crack that appears in one place reveals a structural weakness that was always there, waiting for the right pressure to make it visible. The pressure now is considerable. Within the extended royal family, the reaction to Anne's words has split along lines that were already visible before she spoke, but have now sharpened into something more defined. The people whose loyalty runs primarily to William and Catherine's vision of the monarchy's future have received Anne's revelation with a quiet acknowledgement that reads very much like vindication. It confirms a picture they already held privately. It gives institutional weight to a set of conclusions about Camilla's position that they had drawn from their own observations. The people whose position depends on Camilla's stability within the hierarchy are in a more difficult place. They are not a small group. Camilla has built genuine relationships inside the palace over the years of her marriage to Charles. She has supporters and allies whose investment in her standing is real, and whose discomfort with Anne's words is not merely political. But support and alliance are tools of ordinary palace politics. They function in the normal operating conditions of institutional life. They are less effective when the challenge to someone's position comes not from a rival or a critic, but from the most credible possible source, making the most fundamental possible point. The point Anne has made is not that Camilla is unworthy. It is not a personal attack of the kind that can be dismissed as motivated by jealousy or factional interest. It is something quieter and more devastating than that. It is a correction of the historical record, made by the one person whose authority to make it is beyond question. And historical records once corrected do not uncorrect themselves. For Charles, the fallout carries a particular kind of pain that exists entirely separately from the institutional dimensions of the crisis. He loves his wife. That is not in question. The relationship between Charles and Camilla has survived pressures that would have destroyed most partnerships, and has arrived at a place of evident mutual support and genuine companionship. Whatever its complicated history, whatever damage it caused during the years when it existed in the shadows of other commitments, what it has become in its official form is a real marriage between two people who have chosen each other repeatedly across the full span of their adult lives. Nothing Anne has said changes that, but it changes the frame around it. It means that the marriage exists not inside the story of royal acceptance and family reconciliation that the palace has been carefully maintaining. It exists inside a more complicated story, one that includes a mother-in-law who fulfilled every public obligation while maintaining a private reserve that her most trusted daughter now feels the world deserves to know about. That is not a comfortable story to be the subject of. And Charles, for all his own complicated history with the truth about his private life, is going to have to find a way to carry it. What does all of this ultimately change? It changes the texture of Camilla's legacy inside the institution. It means that history will record her integration into the royal family not as the clean, completed reconciliation that the official narrative presented, but as something more ambiguous, more contested, more honest, perhaps, about the limits of what acceptance actually meant in this particular case. It changes the picture of the Queen herself in ways that are harder to predict. Elizabeth's reputation for dignity and institutional service is not damaged by the revelation that she maintained private reservations about her daughter-in-law. If anything, the knowledge that she delivered perfect public acceptance while privately feeling something more complicated may deepen the respect people hold for the discipline that defined her reign. And it changes Princess Anne's place in the story. She has stepped forward, deliberately, with full knowledge of what her words would mean and full acceptance of the consequences they would carry. She has decided that the historical record matters more than the institutional comfort of letting an incomplete story stand unchallenged. That decision is its own kind of tribute to the woman who raised her, a woman who, above almost everything else, believed that truth had a weight that courtesy could defer but never permanently outweigh. The Queen kept her reservations private for as long as she lived. Anne has decided they deserve to outlive her. And the palace, for all its considerable skill at managing what the world knows about the family at its center, does not currently have an answer for that. Queen Elizabeth accepted Camilla publicly and completely, but acceptance was never the same as trust. Anne knows the difference. She lived it. And now the world knows it too. The official story has a crack in it that is not closing. If this changed how you see the royal family, hit subscribe. There is so much more to come.